So today the article we're going to talk about is Hashim's Military Orientalism. So this is an example of the literature of post-colonialism. So there are tons of things, empirical articles that utilize those concepts that we talked about last week, right? And this was the stuff when we were looking at Said's discussion of the other, Spivak's discussion of the subaltern, and Baba's discussion of hybridity. So there's a lot of empirical stuff that essentially analyzes one piece of discourse or another via this post-colonial critique. So we have an example here of one of these, and essentially, so this is an example of the application of particularly Said to a given phenomenon. Did anybody catch what that phenomenon is? What is being analyzed? What piece of discourse? Do people know what I mean when I say discourse, by the way? What's a discourse? Important word. Contemporary thought. Just linguistically, everyday language, what's a discourse?
Is it kind of like debate in a way?
Yeah, debate or conversation, right? Like you sit down and you have, with a friend and you talk about, I don't know, coffee or classes. Like technically speaking, that's a discourse, right? One person talks, another person talks, right? A lot of times in academic literature, contemporary academic literature, they want to talk about discourse, right? So like basically the thoughts that people produce and write down are pieces of discourse, right? So discourse analysis is essentially anything that attempts to kind of like analyze, tear those things apart, right? So this like discourse analysis would include things like academic text. It could include things like the analysis of newspapers. It could include things like writing about photographs, movies, whatever, right? And it's a big area of sociology, and a lot of post-colonial stuff is particularly a tool to analyze discourse usually, which makes sense because if you think about what was it about last week? Well, what was Said's discussion of the other? What was his idea of the other from your notes from last week? What was he interested in? What was he interested in terms of what the West does with other places?
He's saying that the Orient, how it's constructed by the West, is not the reality of what it actually is.
Yeah. So what we think and how we think about other places is largely driven by what we say about it, not what it actually is, right? That's kind of Said's central point. It's a piece of discourse, right? So he's looking at what is it that Westerners are saying, right? So that's what he's interested in. So it lends itself very easily, right, to this sort of like tearing apart, understanding a piece of discourse. So what's our piece of discourse that Hashim is looking at in this article? What's he critiquing? It's discourse surrounding what?
War, the nature of fighting between different ethnicities and groups.
Yeah, it's a critique of the way we talk about war, and in particular how other people, non-Western peoples, fight in war, right? So that's kind of the central idea. Did anybody catch like what sort of things he dug into to look at this? There's a specific kind of area of. So in a lot of ways, this is a critique of like intellectual discourse. It's a critique of something that scholars write mostly. That's what most of this is. Anybody catch this?
Orientalism.
What's that?
Orientalism.
Okay, yeah. So the term Orientalism, like that's a really this gets a little confusing sometimes. So Orientalism was a discipline at one time, and Orientalism was essentially people who studied Asia and the Middle East, and sometimes Africa. And that was a whole field. There used to be departments of Oriental studies, for a long time in the 19th century and early 20th century. That's kind of died out. But Orientalism sometimes means, and this, like I said, this is confusing, but sometimes it means that discipline. Sometimes it means the stuff that Edward Said does, right? Our article kind of sets up Edward Said, talking about him as a critique of Oriental studies, which is actually what he originally grows out of. So that's what that piece is talking about. This is particularly a critique of military history as a discipline, right? So it's looking at the ways in which military historians largely construct this fictitious other of non-Western peoples, right? The process, how do we see that happening, right, is the question of the whole thing. Okay, I'm going to point us to some text. So let's turn to page 32. This will allow us to dig in a little bit more into Said. So if we look at 32, that first column, if we go down to the paragraph where it says, according to Said. Whenever somebody wants to volunteer to read you.
According to Said, Western powers developed over the course of the 19th century a series of discourses that dominated narratives until they constituted a system of representation. It is to this closely knit web of thought, scholarship, and cultural production, and its empowering institutions that the term Orientalism refers.
Okay, I'll pause you there. So that's kind of what we've been talking about. So anybody want to take a stab at what this paragraph is saying about discourse? Yeah.
They were like kind of dominating Western discourses that created this representation of the Middle East, or not the Middle East, of like Orientalism, and like that's what decided what we see Orientalism as.
Yeah, there's an entire interconnected system, right? He describes it as a closely knit web, right? So there's an interconnected web of thought, right? Scholarship, cultural production, so all these sort of things sort of come together and make a sort of like whole solid system of representation. And by system of representation, what it kind of means is that the way in which we represent other people follow certain rules. And these rules kind of have an internal logic of their own. This is the mechanism, basically, by which Said's claim about our representations of other places not having to do with those places, but having to do with what we say. It's because there's a pattern to how we talk about other people, right? So this is kind of related to something we started with really early on. So do you guys remember when we read Francis Hertog? You guys remember that? This was the guy who wrote about ancient Greece. Do you guys remember this? Ancient Greek attitudes towards the other. His whole project, which is close to Said's project, was to understand the rhetorics of otherness. Basically, what are the tactics we use to make an other? Right? What is the sort of things that we can see happening over and over again in discourse? Essentially, to understand the system of representation is define the patterns. Find the patterns of how we construct the other. And then see how it's applied to different people, right? The same way over and over again. Okay, so one thing we could think about too, and so why analyze? So we're thinking about, like, we spent almost a whole semester talking about all these really repressive things that we do to people, right? Throughout the past, like whether we're talking about regular colonialism, we look at slavery, we look at, right, all these sort of things. Current in contemporary society, the use of the police to suppress people and put them in prison, right? All these things are things that sort of go along with our discussion of race. So my question is, so why talk about discourse, right? So like if we're talking about things that happen to people in a real material way, why is it important to look at the things we say? What do you think?
Because what we say then kind of shapes our attitudes and the way that we then treat other people, or see it as okay to treat other people as different.
Yeah, that there's an interrelationship between what we say and what we do. This is a critique of that grows largely out of. We haven't talked about him in here, but has anybody in any of your other classes talked about Foucault, Michel Foucault? Foucault is probably one of the more important philosophers of the 20th century. And what Foucault is interested in is he's interested in this interrelationship, because we treat knowledge and the construction of knowledge and the construction of culture as if it's somewhat like floating in space, disconnected from real action, right? We treat it as something like, we think about like, even you think about like coming and getting an education, right? You come to college and we sort of act like we're just sitting here saying things, and it doesn't have any relevance to anything that happens in the world. Or if it does, we might be talking about it, but it's not the same thing as acting, right? We treat it as almost like thought and cultural production happens in a laboratory, separated from the world. And Foucault takes a real problem with that. He really wants to claim that knowledge construction and action are the exact same thing. This is often referred to as power knowledge. Right? So you can't remove power from knowledge. Which, like, in some ways doesn't sound that like, you know, you go to an elementary school, there's often signs that say power is knowledge all over the place, right? Which on one hand is sort of a like, get some knowledge and then you'll have some power. But there's also a dark side to that relationship. And that's kind of, if you think about Foucault, that's what he's studying, is the way in which knowledge construction cannot be directly removed from power. That means that the knowledge we construct reflects existing systems of power, and the continuation of that power grows out of our knowledge constructs. So as we construct knowledge, we reinforce existing forms of power. For Foucault, you can't necessarily get out of this. So this isn't just like a call to be a little more sensitive and nice, right? And so the project of deconstruction, is to essentially constantly interrogate the knowledge that we create and how it's connected to real forms of power, the actual things we do. This might be a little too much detail, but in French, which is what Foucault writes in, power works a little bit differently than it does in English. This is also true of German. So we think of power as something that an individual has, right? So like, if I have power, it's something I possess. In French and German, power is an action. I can't remember the French word for it. The German word is machen, which is also the word to make. So if you make dinner, it's literally the same word that you would use for somebody having power. So thinking about that, right? This isn't a passive thing for Foucault. He's literally talking about action. So we could think about it as like, power for Foucault is kind of like something like oppression. So we could look at this as like knowledge and oppression intertwined, right? They're interrelated. One allows the other to exist. Neither happens in a vacuum. So essentially, what Said's doing is following off of Foucault, right? What Said's doing is he's essentially using that same idea, this interrelationship between discourse and action, between power and knowledge, and he's taking and looking at how is it that we see this play out with the hierarchy constructed between the West and other people, right? So that's essentially what Said's doing. Okay, so that's why we look at discourse a lot of the time in post-colonial studies. Okay, so continuing on page 32. The particular concept of this article, which is in the title, right? Generally speaking, if you haven't noticed, articles like to invent their own terms. Academics refer to this jokingly as tenure terms. Like you try to invent terms, that way other people will use it. But anyways, the tenure term of this article is military Orientalism. It's a concept that I haven't seen anywhere else, so I'm guessing our author invented it. So 32, the second full paragraph where there's this, it says furthermore, this is where he specifically discusses military Orientalism. You see where I'm at? So, yep. So let's pick up in the middle of the paragraph where it says it seeks, right? And the it here being military Orientalism. Let's get somebody from over here who wants to read.
Is it the one where it also seeks?
Or no, it seeks. One,
I have it.
yeah, just a little bit above that.
It seeks to
Denigrate.
denigrate and dehumanize and render illegitimate others' application of violence. It also seeks to glorify the Western way of war and legitimize its own violence. This emphasis has resulted in a historical contrast between a supposedly decisive Western way of war, in which armies faced each other, and its devious and shifty Eastern counterparts, who deliberately shied away from battle.
Okay, so what's the linchpin of military Orientalism? What does it seek to do?
It justifies Western wars, and they seem good, whereas Eastern wars seem I don't know, it says shifty and they're not playing fair, or it's different and not justifiable.
Yeah, so what it's saying is we see within discussions of military strategy and military history, right? So when people talk about military strategy, they actually find ways of utilizing military strategy to legitimate Western violence and to delegitimate non-Western violence. Western violence becomes honorable, right? And it becomes heroic. Non-Western violence becomes shifty and underhanded. And so basically this becomes a way of saying that Western wars are good. Any resistance, so it's not even like Eastern wars, because we're actually talking about moments when the West invades other places, right? So this history, we could draw it back to colonialism, our authors do. Our author actually draws this process back much further than that even. But any resistance, right, to that Western violence is seen as particularly sort of, basically amoral. And that this is reinforced, even our author would say ramped up in recent years. Okay. So how do we see that? How do we see this difference between the way we claim Westerners fight versus non-Westerners? What terms do we use for non-Western combat? What are some adjectives we use? How do non-Westerners fight in wars?
Disorganized.
They're less organized, maybe. It's kind of, what does it mean to be organized, right, is a good question. So yeah, the claim of military Orientalism is that it's disorganized. What else?
Is it maybe like in the West, you like fight more like as a country, whereas Eastern wars, it's more like groups fighting each other that aren't necessarily like linked with their nation?
So yeah, you have in the West you have sort of national armies. In non-Western places, that's less common, right? So, which is tied in with that, right? So you have other forms of organization. And there is this claim, right, that the ways that people fight grow out of a long tradition. We're going to see why this is significant, right? This sort of long tradition of them fighting amongst themselves, right? So like military historians will talk about the way in which like Arab people or Persian people, Iranians, or North Africans fight is growing out of like tribal warfare or something like that, right? It's not entirely true, right? But this is sort of the presentation that they give it. So grows out of, if you will, old histories, which makes the Western warfare, right? Not only do we have large national armies, but it's, if you will, it's in our own time. There's this, so this gets us into one of these patterns, right? One of these sets of rules that we find over and over again in Oriental discourse. It's the way I like to frame it, there's a post-colonial scholar by the name of Fabian who talks about the denial of coevalness.